Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jeff. This is Jeff Reads, and today I'm going to be talking about book one of The Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my history with The Wheel of Time. I discovered it when I was living out in Los Angeles back in the 90s. Went into a bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard. I was living just off the boulevard at the time, and saw this cover and this very similar mass market paperback. And at the time I was, definitely still reading fantasy, and bought it. I think The Great Hunt had just come out, the second book, and that was in trade paperback. Took it home, read it, was blown away. It was some of the best fantasy I'd read since Tolkien, I think, which I'd read as an adolescent. And then I went right back out and bought The Great Hunt afterwards, read that. And then I think maybe it was another 4 or 5 months until Dragon Reborn came out. And so most of it, like the first half of the 90s, every year was this wonderful gift by Robert Jordan of a new book in the Wheel of Time. And the first 5 books are just astonishingly good. I mean, they have their, their sluggish moments. They have their repetitiveness, which I'll get into a little bit as I start to talk about this. But it's really good fantasy. I mean, I struggled. I think I never made it past Lord of Chaos. So I've got up to So Fires of Heaven was the last full book that I finished. And that I finished, I think, in the 90s. Hardcover when it came out, bought it. And then I stalled on Lord of Chaos. I think some part of me was getting tired of how laborious Jordan could be. And my reading tastes had changed at that point, and I was really finally getting into some heavy literature and classics, and I wasn't reading as much fantasy. But I would go back every 5 or 6 years. I'd go back and I'd reread the first 5 books, or first 4 or 5 books, and I'd get to Lord of Chaos and I would stall every time. I think, so I've done this, I've read the first 5 books 3 times, initially when they were coming out, and then twice when, they were half finished or he was dead and no one had finished it yet. And so I've never made it past, Lord of Chaos. I never got to the Slog. I never got to Knife of Dreams, and obviously never read the Sanderson novels. But so as I'm getting more back into reading heavily, some part of me is like, we got to finish The Wheel of Time. It's like it's one of the, the top heavy hitter fantasies. There's 14 bloody books. I know all about the Slog, or I've heard about the Slog that happens. I think that starts maybe with Crown of Swords, Path of Daggers, and goes up to Crossroads of Twilight. I've read reviews of Crossroads of Twilight, spoiler free, and that just people hate on it so badly. Like, nothing happens, you can skip it, So I don't know how I'm going to do with this Slog. I'm going to try to read everything this time through. But I just finished Eye of the World again today, and it's so good. It's so good. So I want to talk a little bit about it. There'll be some mild spoilers because it's hard to imagine anyone on BookTube who hasn't read some of this series. It won't be heavy-duty spoilers, but in a way, you could throw some spoilers at anybody reading Eye of the World, and it's not going to spoil the reading pleasure, because this book isn't really about hidden plot twists and reveals that are like you would ruin it. It's pretty much a standard template going forward. So, all right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So the book starts pretty much in the Tolkien vein. We start in a small town. We meet some sheep herders, some villagers. Then a magic user and a fighter come to the town. There's something special about these people in the town, and 5 of them leave with the magic user and head over a ferry to an inn, very much like Frodo in Lord of the Rings, right? So the first maybe third of the book, very much Lord of the Rings, but even so, there's a stately pace to it, and Jordan's very, very and Jordan's prose is really wonderful. He's one of the best fantasy prose writers out there. I mean, his prose is very strong. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But so then you get to a point when they, after they get to what is, in my mind, is kind of like in Lord of the Rings, right? When the hobbits get to Sign of the Prancing Pony in Bree, there's a town called Baerlon, and this kind of, so it's very Tolkien-esque up until you get to Baerlon, and then it changes a little bit. It doesn't have the kind of this grand sweep of Tolkien, but it starts to do other things. And one of the things I think I realized this time around was as a reader, I really love, I hate to admit it, but I'm kind of ADD as a reader. And I want something jumping off the page at me as I read. So if it's a thriller, I want a really good plot, plot twist. If it's a literary book, I want really good prose or rich characterizations or richness of place. If it's fantasy and science fiction, I kind of want something new every chapter. I love Neuromancer by William Gibson because I feel like, and he even said this in interviews, he's like, I want on every page the reader to be hit with something new and novel and strange. And to me, in Neuromancer, he does that. At every page, besides the incredible prose of that book, you're getting hit with something every time you turn a page. There's something new, some new idea, some cool action, some new plot twist. And Eye of the World is very much like that in the latter 2/3 of it. And I think what I've really recognized now that my fantasy loves are more towards fantasy that really is novel, where every chapter or two, I'll even give it, you're showing me something new, a new world, a new magic system, a strange creature, a really interesting character trait, like something. I think sometimes when I don't enjoy fantasy as much is when it kind of just trundles along and there's not a lot of magic, the characters are kind of blah, the world is very samey, and I'm not getting hit with that kind of novelty, and I don't really... I just started reading Dragon's Bane by Barbara Hambly because it gets a lot of good press by a lot of big-time fantasy authors. I think George R.R. Martin and Ted Williams like her. And it was, I'm like 3/4 of the way through, and it's very standard fare. There's a land, there's some warriors, there's not a lot of magic. It's not super interesting. You've seen a lot of this stuff before, very samey. Her prose is good, and the characters are kind of good, but I'm kind of flagging because it's boring me, actually. So it's not that it's bad, I just kind of demand a high level of novelty from my fantasy, right? So once you get past Baerlon in The Wheel of Time, so this will be minor spoilers for some places and some things that happen. For those of you who haven't read Wheel of Time, you may want to not watch this portion of it. But so right after Baerlon is Shadar Logoth, which is this really cool evil city, crumbling, and there's an evil spirit in there. There's a character called Mordeth, who's really cool. Then you're introduced to the White Cloaks, the Wheel of Time's version of the Knights Templar, right? Then you're introduced to Perrin's character change. He's going to become a character who runs with wolves. He has a kind of a Beastmaster character, right? This affinity he has for the wolves. Very cool turn. Then you're with the Tinkers and the Traveling People, the Way of the Leaf. You're introduced to this philosophy that they have. And you hear a little tale of something that happened in the Blight. Then you're with Rand and Matt and Tom Merrilin, and you're doing a sea voyage down the river, which is very interesting. There are dream worlds that they seem to interact with other characters in, which is very cool. And later in the later books, this is expanded on a lot. Then there's a bit of a slog. There's a point where a couple of the main characters go through. They're kind of traveling on the road to this town called Camelin City, I should say. And they're just going through tavern after tavern after tavern, having very similar repetitive adventures, and it's kind of boring. So there's maybe like a 4 or 5 chapter slog in the middle of this. That's like, all right, we've done the inn, Jordan. What another inn? What is it? It doesn't really build character too much. I'll talk a little bit about what it may do a little bit later on, because it's not without effect in a certain way, right? But then you come to Camelin, and you're introduced to a whole set of new characters who are going to play a larger role as the novel goes on. You see this character Loghain, and you hear about false dragons. The whole Camelin set is really wonderful about what happens. A lot of great character stuff happens, and one of the main characters literally falls into the royal family for a brief period. And there's a wonderful reunion of characters who had been split up prior to this. Then you're introduced to the Ways, which are this wonderful kind of like physics experiment gone awry by magic users back in the day. And the Ways are really cool. Then you're introduced to a whole new city and a whole new group of people when you're up in Shinar, and they're fighting these, the Trollocs, who are the main, the kind of the orcs of this world. Then there's this brief excursion into the Blight, and they're fighting trees and all these evil creatures. And then there's an incredibly rousing finale. Like, the finale is really good in Eye of the World. For a single character, It's not like a rousing finale that we're used to in film where there's a big battle, a lot of explosions, but it is an emotionally rousing character finale. What happens? It's very satisfying, and I seem to remember that Jordan's endings are very good, at least for the first 5 books. It may be sluggish getting some of them, but he gives you a hell of an ending for the most part, from what I can remember. And Eye of the World's definitely that. So wonderful novelty. So I'm reading this, and the magic system that he developed for this book is wonderful. Split along gender lines, but within that split, there's also ways it's used with tokens and ways it's certain non-magic users can use it if they have something invested with this power. So it's really cool. The magic system is really great. It doesn't come into enormous play here. That's going to be developed as we go. But it's a very cool magic system and very easily understandable and yet complex enough to be interesting. And the characters are great. I mean, they're really, when you think back on Eye of the World, he introduced us to, 6 or 7 main characters who will populate most of the rest of the books. And they're very distinct, very memorable. They all have distinct personalities. They're versions of cliche in one way or the other, but not so much. Moiraine is a wonderful character. Rand, Mat, and Perrin are kind of, versions of, the kind of the Luke Skywalker, if you will. And they'll complexify wonderfully as the books keep going. But they're fun characters, and their interactions, Jordan is very good with dialogue and character, at least here. There are things that he does in the later books, the repetitions sometimes that drive you a little crazy. But he's very good with characters. So I was really kind of impressed this time when I realized how quickly, within the first third of the book, once these characters set off from the 2 rivers, he's juggling 6, 7 characters. They're all distinct personalities. They have distinct habits and ways and distinct weaponry. Very stark and clear that you really can understand, and not a lot of sameness. So the characters are very well drawn. It's very impressive, actually. When I'm rereading it now, I'm like, boy, he did a hell of a job with the characters. So besides the novelty of the book, the characters are ones where you get into it and you're invested with them and you want to see what's going to happen to them. And then on top of that, his prose is very good. I would put Jordan at the top tier. I mean, fantasy doesn't draw hardcore prose stylists, let's face it. Genre fiction rarely does. I mean, there are a few standouts. Gormenghast is definitely one. I would put Jordan up there. Tolkien is there. But in terms of, stuff that's come after the 80s, I think fantasy as a rule has a better serviceable level than science fiction. It kind of started later, I think, in some ways. So I think fantasy as a genre is kind of written universally better, because sci-fi you have to contend with all the shit written in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Some of it is very hard to get through. But it's it's nothing special prose-wise. But I think Jordan is a cut above. His prose is very strong, very muscular, very few adverbs. Really, he can write. And I mean, think about, he wrote a trilogy about the colonial history of the Carolinas, the Fallon Blood. So there's 3 novels there. He wrote an unpublished novel, which I think was published recently, called Warriors of the Altai, which he kind of put in a drawer because he didn't like it. Then he wrote 7 Conan novels, Robert E. Howard's Conan. So by the time he headed into, the Wheel of Time, he had written like 11 novels. So he really had a command of the medium, and his prose is wonderful. So that leads me into what I think is really special about this, and it's the world building. And again, I'm not just a fan. You can't just world build me. You got to have, it's got to, for me, for fantasy, even for science fiction, there's got to be more. I can't, if you can build a wonderful world, and I might be able to appreciate it, but I'm not going to follow you for 10 books. But Jordan's world building is wonderful, and I think it goes hand in hand with his style. He takes his time. He sets scenes. He takes his time and really sets scenes. So when you get somewhere, like, he lays out for a few pages, and the smells, the sights, what's going on, how it looks. Cities are distinct from one another. So wherever you go in this book, and this is the problem, so the negative side of it is, so there's a point in this book where, again, the characters are traveling through a bunch of taverns heading towards this city called Camelin. And it's a bit of a slog because he is setting the scene in every bloody tavern, on every little road, and every little thing he has a tendency to go down the rabbit hole of incidental incident. So where another writer might say, they set out at dawn, and might do it in a sentence, Jordan will write 3 pages about how they put the saddle on the horse and how hay fell off the roof and somebody banged their elbow on the thing going out and they shouted to the stable boy to hurry up, right? So it depends on what your tastes are for a reader. Sometimes that stuff maybe early on in a novel can be nice because he's kind of setting the scene. But I think when you're 3/4 of the way through the book and he's still doing that, it drives you crazy. However, so here's what I think is interesting about world building and about over describing, is that it does lend more authenticity to the world. So sometimes it is a slog to get through some of his chapters. And you are like, okay, Jordan, I don't need to know, how many nails are in the hoofs that he put on the horse and who put it on and the history of blah, 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 blah. I think later on it gets worse where he does clothing, like, he does pages on people's clothing, which I think drives some readers crazy. So the negative side of it is, if you're going novel to novel to novel, it's like, it's too much. It's too many words, not doing enough work in a way. But it works. I think on a subliminal level, all of that detail makes the world a rich place. So in a way, as you're reading through it, even though you're frustrated, there's an authenticity that's being built in this world that's really, I haven't really read a lot of recent Brandon Sanderson, so I don't know how he does it. I haven't read Malazan. I've tried reading Gardens of the Moon twice, and it seems insurmountable. So I don't know about, comparing him to other modern fantasy writers, but the authenticity and the tactile sense of this Wheel of Time, I think they call it Ranlands because he never named the area where the main continent, like Tolkien named Middle Earth, and you have the map. There's a map of the Wheel of Time world, but I don't think it's ever given a name. Wheel of Time heads probably know it, and I don't know it. Sometimes I see it written as Ranland because Rand's the main character. But all of that prose and all of that over detailing, it does do a number on you. And when you get finished with one of his books, that world is very richly embedded in your imagination, however frustrating it might be. So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think there are times when it's too much and you're just eating cornflakes without the milk and you're like, come on, Jordan, let's go. Like 2 sentences there on the road, let's move. And other times when you enter a new place, especially when you enter any new city or new area that he brings you through, it's wonderful when he sets you up and you really see these places. And I remember back after 4 or 5 books, boy, you really know this world, and it becomes a very known, comfortable place when the new installment of the book comes. Like, you're ready. It all springs back to you pretty quickly. So there are pluses and minuses in terms of the world building in that way. So overall, I loved it. But I am going to try and read the full 14-book series. I guess plus there's a prequel, New Spring, which I've never read. But I think the key to reading Jordan, for me anyway, is take my time and read him slow. I think the 2 times that I binge read the first 5 books, when I got to Lord of Chaos, too many words, not enough going on, and it just was overfill. And by the time I got to Lord of Chaos, and it starts very slowly, I was like, enough, I can't take it. So I think this time, I just finished Eye of the World. I think I'm gonna read 1 or 2 other books in between, let it settle a little bit, and give the Wheel of Time books a couple of books in between, so when I get to Great Hunt next, I'm a little hungry for it. And so if there's some repetition or there's some description that's a little, I've read somewhere that in the latter books, he tends to try to reintroduce the reader to the world in the book that he is in each book. And when you were, I guess, hanging on every book year over year, it was maybe kind of nice, like after 12 months, you get a new book and a little refresher course, and then off you go. So I kind of need to build that back in. I think I need to build some space in between the books. But I'm enjoying actually even reading certain chapters slowly, because Jordan has a tendency, he really is a good storyteller, but he also gets in his way. So there's times when you'll read 1 or 2 or 3 chapters in a row where he's cooking on all cylinders. And then there'll be a couple of chapters where it's just, it's too wordy. You know that he could do more with less. And I want to race through and skim. And I think at this point, like when I got to the certain slog in this book, the middle chapters when they're going through all those taverns, I was like, put the book aside. I felt myself being excited at wanting to go forward with the story. And then I was like, but Jordan's pace denies my excitement. He doesn't care how excited I am. He's very deliberate, and he doesn't feel the sweep of his story sometimes that a reader might feel. He's going to plod along and do his own thing. And sometimes it's maddening when you want to get to that next part of his story and you know you got to go through 4 or 5 chapters that are going to be a little slow. So this time through, I really took my time, and when I found myself bumping up against those slow chapters, I just stopped, put it aside, and I had another book going during this as well. So if I wanted to read, I just kind of switched off and read another book for a while, and maybe a day went by, and then I came back to it, and then kind of the excitement had settled, and I could do the slow chapters and get built back up again. And so I thought, okay, this is the way I need to do the Wheel of Time. Within each book, I need to read very slowly. And Jordan is enjoyable to read slowly because he's such a good prose writer. It's enjoyable to read him slowly. I also do a tandem in the audiobook. So if I'm commuting on the bus or on the subway, if it's dark or if it's nighttime and the audiobooks are chaptered, I'll switch off from the book to boom, I'll be in the audiobook for maybe 1 or 2 chapters. And the audio performers tend to take things a little slower than if you were reading it. And it's wonderful because his prose can handle it. There are certain writers when the audiobooks take a little longer to read where you're just like, get on with it. You know, it's not that intense. Just kind of let's go. But with Jordan, it's fine. I don't mind backing off and allowing the prose to be a little languorous because his sentences are terrific. I really enjoy them. So I think that's going to be my plan. So hopefully over the next year, I mean, this is the end of 2022, I'll probably read The Great Hunt before the end of the year, and then continue on maybe a book every 4 or 5 weeks. We'll see. But I really want to get through this 14-book series, and I want to try to record every book on my channel. And to do, you know, I'm kind of an odd latecomer. Even though I was there at the Wheel of Time when it kind of started, I'm still like a latecomer finishing the series and knowing it really well. And this is probably the 14 millionth YouTube video on, you know, Eye of the World, but such is life. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.